Zdravstvuyte, and welcome to episode 16 of my Soviet Union vlog. Today we're going to be thinking about art and culture and hopefully religion, which might make it quite a long episode. Sorry for that. This is all part of theme 3, which is about control of the Soviet Union. And so we're thinking about how art and culture changed, policies towards art and culture changed over time. Which is one of the key sort of questions that could be asked about them, but also about how effective the Soviet leaders are in using them as a tool of control. And the same with religion as well. And I would say there have been questions in the past which have asked, so let me give an example. How far did Soviet culture limit personal artistic expression in the year 17 to 85? That's a bit of a nightmare. There's one here. How accurate is it to say that government restrictions on artistic and cultural expression remained unchanged in the year 17 to 85? That's quite a lot better, that one. How accurate is it to say that Soviet leadership's hostility to religion remained remarkably consistent? That's not one I'd want to take on. I think like doing religion by itself, wouldn't touch it with barge pole myself. Art, oh dear, not a huge fan. But definitely, if you're asked a question about control, I think there's definite scope for using art and religion as part or one of the other options of that. Or if it's a question about was religion the most effective way of controlling the Soviet population, then that would work too. So let's get started. We're going to whiz through, hopefully whiz-ish, through the the policies towards artists. And remember, we are sort of thinking about change and continuity here. Actually, let's just say it at the start. In almost all of these sort of policy things where you're looking across all the way from 1917 to 85, the four main leaders are pretty consistent in their attitude to anything, really. So Lenin's time in power tends to be marked by an initial, very ideological driven, slightly chaotic, revolutionary phase. And then it sort of starts to settle down and grab more control after the Civil War. Stalin is pretty conservative in his attitudes to most things, not particularly ideological, just kind of straightforwardly conservative and very controlling. Khrushchev is much more likely to have taken the handbrake off and allowed more freedom of expression, but also quite ideological. He's also the most likely to kind of have had slightly erratic policies. And Brezhnev is pretty moderate, pretty conservative in his tastes, and pretty unchanging as well. So he's kind of like a passive Stalin, a passive and moderate Stalin. And like I say, their policies tend to fit into those sort of things. So you're thinking, oh, I wonder what his policy was. That's kind of like what the theme would be, and that's kind of how the change of continuity works as well. So 3 minutes in, let's get going quickly. So Lenin and art and culture. We'll do art and culture first. This is so following the revolution. There's an initial emphasis on new and experimental arts movements. Anatoly Lunacharsky is the key figure here. Lunacharsky, Lunacharsky. He argued that proletarian art should be used after the revolution to distinguish it from the bourgeois art that had been around before. Lenin actually disagreed with that slightly and said that actually the best bourgeois art should be included and copied from and learned from by the proletariats. It's not a case of ditching everything before, it's just that it should be learned and adapted. Lenin in particular disliked futurism, just didn't like it. And that tends to reflect that his sort of kind of slightly middle-aged man type attitude to things, that he already had art and culture that he liked and he wanted to adapt it to the revolution, whereas Lunacharsky is coming from a much more radical revolutionary perspective, saying no, we must ditch all of this and crack on. And so there is that kind of tension there. After the Civil War, Lenin gets more control over things and they settle down a lot more. And they're less revolutionary and less out of control and less experimental. Lenin and Trotsky both believed that art could be used to inspire and gain support of the people. So they set up what was called Agitprop, Agitprop. And this is basically using artists to agitate and provide propaganda. So there's famously they had these trains that went around in the Civil War for all sorts of things, but painted on the sides of them will be images to inspire people to fight on their side in the Civil War. There's that great Kandinsky painting, I think it's Kandinsky, Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge, which is quite futurist, I suppose, very modern. And this chap Alexander Rodchenko, which is spelled exactly how you think it is, he is a famous photographer and graphic designer, and he works on things with the Soviet government as well. So quite a lot of kind of new thought going on there. Lenin also had big ideas about cinema. He thought cinema was really important and that should also be used to inspire support for the government. So they're very much using art to control. There's two people here you might want to mention. Dziga Vertov. Dziga is his first name, Dziga, and Vertov is his second name, Vertov, Vertov. An experimental filmmaker, quite out there, I suppose, rejected the Hollywood star, preferred to make cinema a fact, filming people as they worked, and that is quite socialist and communist. But his series of documentaries of truth were regarded as, quote, insane, puzzling, and laughable. So maybe not quite so accessible as some of the stuff that would be later on. Sergei Eisenstein is the other filmmaker you should know about. He made a series of films in the 20s, combining revolutionary images with some experimental filmmaking, but he does tell quite clear stories, unlike Vertov, who's much more kind of like, let's just watch. He's focused mainly on revolutionary films. Blah, blah, blah. He is sometimes criticised for not being that accessible. Now, that's the Lenin phase. Stalin, actually, it's quite quick with Stalin, really. He wanted art to express government opinion. Stop. So, like Lenin, he's using art to control and put forward the government message. But he very much believed that individual creativity should be accessible to all and is very much more strict in the censorship of the art and culture that's put out, as you'd expect. And of course, there's a lot more bite to his censorship because of the whole terror through the 30s. Socialist realism is the big catchphrase here. Alexander Gerasimov is Gerasimov. He said that socialist realism was, quote, realistic in form, socialist in content. And I quite like that as a really just very straightforward way of talking about it. And Zhdanov, the Politburo member, said that the purpose of art and culture was to show our heroes, as in kind of display our heroes, and glimpse our tomorrow. And so socialist realism was about portraying things as they are, but kind of with a slightly optimistic view ahead, kind of like predicted great, I suppose. That the idea that this is the best that the Soviet Union could be and should be. And so, as just an example of that, lots of sort of paintings tended to be of socialist things, but look very much like kind of pictures, very kind of old school type paintings. Modern art was out. Statues, again, you'd expect the statue to look like the person, but perhaps in quite a heroic form. And likewise, statues of peasants and particularly industrial workers. Same true for novels. I'm just going to give you a little extract, no, not an extract, a summary of a novel. So socialist realism books. Cement is talked about in the textbook. And this is How the Steel Was Tempered by somebody, Nikolai Ostrovsky. Ostrovsky, Ostrovsky. This is probably just off Wikipedia or something, but it says the hero of the novel is Pavel Korchagin, who lives a life of sacrifice for betterment. He fights in the Civil War, where he receives a cracked skull and a severely damaged spine. He plays his part in the reconstruction after the Civil War, becomes a Red Writer by taking a correspondence course. He chooses to marry a mousy, unawakened girl, who he encourages to become a member of the party. When she is admitted to the party, it is a day of great joy for him, despite the fact that he is paralysed, blind, and dying. So, very much kind of like focusing in on those themes of like, well, what would be good for a socialist person? Oh, it's this, even though there's personal sacrifice there. In fact, it's a semi-autobiographical novel, so that's sad as well. So that's Stalin. Khrushchev was keen to allow more cultural freedom, but Khrushchev gets caught in a series of thaws followed by crackdowns. And I was looking back at this, and actually, the thaws make a lot of sense. So there are three main thaws. After Stalin's death, works critical of Stalin were released. For instance, The Thaw by a writer called Ilya Ehrenburg, Ehrenburg, which is critical of the terror. Then, after the secret speech in 1956, again, there's another thaw. And in 1962, when Khrushchev has his sort of third go at being critical of Stalin, Stalin's body is removed from Red Square. And again, there's a thaw. And at this time, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is published by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Of course. So there's those sort of thaws, and you can notice there each of the thaws actually is to help Khrushchev with his anti-Stalin de-Stalinization message, and therefore sort of promotes Khrushchev by being critical of the previous leader. But in between, he's unable to control what comes out, and so he has these crackdowns. And a great example of that is in 1957 when there was a crackdown on Dr. Zhivago, the novel by Boris Pasternak. Zhivago, if you don't know, is Zivago, and Boris Pasternak, Pasternak, which is critical, sort of semi-critical, really. It shows how the Civil War was a hard time and not great for everyone, and therefore it's kind of critical of Lenin. So that's very embarrassing for Khrushchev when that's smuggled abroad and published, and then it's published in 1957. And then wins the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1958. And Khrushchev refuses to let Pasternak go and get it. It becomes a bit of an international incident. Very embarrassing for the Soviet Union. And that's an example of where the crackdown happened because it wasn't portraying the message that Khrushchev wanted, but he finds it quite difficult to have the thaw, but then the crackdown. Khrushchev also uses art to try and control the behaviour of people, as well as putting out the message the government wants, to try and challenge lazy behaviour and alcoholism through poster campaigns. They also have campaigns against Western attitudes amongst women, what they called style hunters, women who are looking to Western fashion, to try and promote a kind of more socialist Soviet way of life, I suppose. Similar sort of story under Brezhnev. He has tighter boundaries than Khrushchev. He's more consistent than Khrushchev. So lots of artists actually found it slightly easier because they knew where they were with Brezhnev. He's less strict than Stalin. A couple of examples, though, of the strictness. Joseph Brodsky, this is in the textbook, but he was prosecuted in 1964 for writing or composing poetry without being part of the Writers' Union. That's a great example of how censorship remains even under Brezhnev. He's trying to control what people write and publish by knowing about it beforehand. And then there's the famous Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel trial in 1966, which you ought to know about. They're put on trial basically for writing stuff that's subversive to the Soviet state. They smuggled it abroad and had it published under a different name, under pseudonyms, but they are caught out. So this shows that there are boundaries that are crossed. It also, though, shows that there's a growing number of dissident artists. An example of that, I'm not sure where I got this from, in 1968, Nonna Gurionova is spelled, well, Nonna is Nonna, and Gurionova is Goriunova. She performed, or had performed, she, don't know actually, they performed their play, Forest Ritual, out in the woods. And increasingly, different artists trying to do those sort of things. They publish things discreetly or illegally, basically, in various places. Sometimes they're ignored. Sometimes there's a bit of a crackdown if people hear about it. But yeah. And there's an increasing amount of samizdat published as well, illegal publishings of things. So, actually, finally, under Andropov in the early 80s, there's a great example which I read about, I think this was just from the textbook actually, about how that control continues to try and control what's going on through music. On the radio, 20% of airtime was given to artists who were not officially official Soviet composers, but 80% was still for those people that had kind of gone through the system. So there's kind of an acknowledgement that they couldn't control everything, and they hoped by just easing off a little bit, they could still control most of it. All rock groups were vetted before performing to make sure their messages were in line with Soviet values, I suppose. And actually, again, the textbook says increasingly these were conservative values, really. So singing or writing explicitly about sex or that sort of thing was likely to get you in trouble as much as writing about political things, or maybe even more than writing about political things, because it's about values and traditional kind of family type values that they were trying to promote. So just to turn briefly in terms of continuity and change before we think about religion. Continuity, very much using art and culture to further the leader and to further the regime, the values and beliefs of the regime, as well as the ideology. And all the way through, use of state control and censorship. The change really is about the amount of flexibility, the amount of freedom that's given increases over time, and the boldness of dissidents increases over time. And if I were being asked about control and how effective it was, I would say that the decrease in terror and secret police, the fear of secret police, it's no coincidence that that sees an increase in the rise of dissidents publishing and writing. So much more briefly, but importantly, policy towards religion. Well, policy towards religion is pretty straightforward, really, in that communism is really against religion, certainly against organized religion. Marx was an atheist and saw religion as being really an attempt by the establishment, particularly he's talking about the church, the Christian church in Europe, being aligned with the establishment and trying to put people in a position where they went along with the establishment and were controlled by the establishment. So there's a kind of a historic as well as a religious reason for being anti-Christian and anti-church, but that is really anti-religion in a more general sense. So Lenin, in 1917, the decree on land gives peasants the right to seize land belonging to the church, and followed up in 1918 by the decree concerning separation of church and state, which removed the privileges of the Orthodox Church. Privileges including, there were some legal privileges, but also the right to own property taken away from them, their assets were seized, the civil rights of clergy were removed. And then in the Civil War, the terror was used against the Orthodox Church. They were seen as being, well, they probably were on the side of the whites, to be fair, and they were seen as being anti-revolutionary, counter-revolutionary. A couple of examples of that. In January 1918, Orthodox priests in Moscow were massacred after they'd excommunicated the Bolsheviks. And the Metropolitan, it's like the Bishop of the Orthodox Church, the Metropolitan of Kiev, as we say now, Vladimir, was tortured and shot as well in January 1918, both of those. Initially, those Bolshevik plans also applied to Islamic institutions, where they were saying seize property owned by Islamic institutions, but they're quickly reversed. And actually, they become quite collaborative with Islamic institutions. They fund Islamic schools and work alongside them. And that's really because there's no historic link between the Tsar and Islam, or Tsarism and Islam. So there's much less animosity to start with on both sides. Stalin, of course, carries on these policies, very anti-church, turns churches into grain stores and all that sort of stuff in the 30s, until the Second World War, when he needs really all the help he can get. So in the Second World War, there's a relaxation, and he appeals to the church for their support in this nationalistic, patriotic war against the Nazis. 414 churches are allowed to reopen during the Second World War. In terms of his relationship to Islam, pretty similar to Lenin, except that you'd say that the terror does disproportionately affect Islamic, some Islamic ethnic groups. So, for instance, Sufi, SUFI groups in Turkestan are pretty much destroyed by the terror because Stalin picks on these some of these groups around the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, interestingly, is much more anti-religion than Stalin had been in his later days, and so reimposes a lot of the a lot of the persecution that Lenin had, closing churches that had been reopened in the war, big increase in anti-religion propaganda. He uses the space race amusingly in this regard. So Yuri Gagarin is asked whether he'd seen God when he'd gone into space, and he hadn't, of course. So that's kind of seen as proof that there is no God. Valentina Tereshkova, who was the first woman in space, said that her flight had been a victory for atheism, because again, the heavens, as it were, had been exposed as being just a space rather than God's living quarters. So Khrushchev, very anti-religion, and Brezhnev is much more kind of passive and relaxed about it. So he ends the overt persecution. He's still anti-religion. He's still atheist, but he believes that you don't really need to keep going after it. That actually science would undermine religion, so you can just sit back and be lazy about it, I suppose. I wouldn't say that in my essay, though. Interestingly, Brezhnev supports anti-American Islamic groups in the Middle East. And because of that, he does allow limited contact between Soviet Islamic leaders and those in other countries. So there's a little bit more relaxation again on the Islamic end of things there. Brezhnev actually said that Islam was a progressive, anti-colonial and revolutionary creed. So in general, all of the leaders are more relaxed and more likely to work with the Islamic groups in Central Soviet Union, the sort of stand states, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan type areas, and tend to be more harsh on the Christian stuff in the west of the Soviet Union. Although Brezhnev comes across as being quite moderate there, it is worth noting that he's not so helpful at all to Jews who wanted to emigrate from the Soviet Union to Israel, and that becomes a bit of a point of contention in his time in power. So in terms of change of continuity here, there are changes in the amount of persecution, but there's a lot of continuity in being anti-religious and in persecuting religious groups. And how effective is it? As a way of controlling the people, I would say that Stalin's realization in the Second World War that he could do with the support of the church is a good demonstration that it's not particularly effective. And the resurgence of Christian groups under Gorbachev later on again shows that they survive. They don't have the same influence as they did have perhaps under the Tsar, and so that sort of semi-effective position would probably be what I'd go for, but not as effective as a way of controlling the people as more overt ways like terror, even like the cult personality, and that sort of thing. So sorry that's so long, but it's important to get through both, I think, at this time. Next time, I'll think a little bit about the secret police in the last of our control videos.